My name is Fite Wassilak. I'm an independent writer and curator, and I thought around the show today would be more proposing some other objects alongside the objects and things that Mark Leckie's chosen to think about. Not just how technology augments our reality and the human experience, but also why and the desires behind some of those modifications and some of the desires and fantasies that we project onto. There were sort of three ideas that I was thinking of. Pareidolia, which is when we project or when we find patterns in a place where they don't exist. So say seeing animals in the clouds, or seeing the Virgin Mary in a piece of toast, and also things like anthropomorphism, say to give an example, say like Tron, where the computer programs are people that we see inside the computer, and also just some of the ideas of transhumanism, which is using directly, I suppose, technology to augment the human experience. But the way I wanted to think about these was through three heads as objects or imaginary objects, some fictional and some real, that we could then use to think about some of the other things in the show. So the first head being the TV character Max Headroom from the mid-'80s, who was meant to be a computer-generated TV personality, who in the story was a journalist whose memories and everything were uploaded into a computer program, who then became its own autonomous character in itself. But then this character was, it then became a TV show and an advertising agent for Coca-Cola in the 80s as well. And what was interesting as well is when they used to present him as a technological entity, it was an actor covered with latex and foam prosthetics wearing a plexiglass suit, and they used old-fashioned animation techniques to achieve a digital effect behind him as well. So it was kind of imagining a future that didn't actually exist, let's say, but then it becoming a commercial, successful entity in itself. And then the second head I wanted to think about was my own head when I visited the Walt Disney World's Epcot Center, which was a prototypical city that Walt Disney had imagined in the late 60s before he died to be the new focus of the new resort that they were opening in Florida. This didn't happen when they opened the new resort in 1971, but in '82 then a version of Epcot was opened. That wasn't quite the city that he'd envisioned, but more kind of selectively sponsored showcase of some technology. And visiting the Epcot Center as a 6-year-old, there was a showcase of robotic arms that would draw your portrait. And for me, I really wanted my portrait done by a robot. You know, it's the coolest thing you could do as a kid, probably. And so after queuing for hours and hours and failing one day and returning another day and queuing for hours, I finally got the portrait, and it was a horrible, horrible image of just this outline of a pudgy little kid. I think I threw the portrait away. I'd like to find it now if I could. And then the third head was Walt Disney's head itself. After he died of lung cancer in 1966, the myth had emerged in a French magazine in 1969 that they'd chopped off his head and frozen it and kept it in cryogenic or cryonic freezing for as cryonics is keeping humans alive, or keeping humans frozen till an indeterminate date when the technology means they can be brought to life again. And the myth was that Disney's head was underneath the Pirates of the Caribbean ride in Disneyland. But I think the cryonics poses an interesting thing of this idea of turning humans into objects. This sort of aspiration of people wanting to be exist in the future, and that they're most cryonics, people who are frozen in cryonics are neuropreservation, so that their heads are just preserved while the rest of the body is thrown away. And what this means, generally you have these containers filled with heads existing around the place, not dissimilar maybe to what we have presented here. Thinking of objects as carriers of history and narrative and impulse, I suppose, and that these impulses are kind of significant tell us what kind of desires we have at the moment. So I thought it was interesting to think about, say, Max Headroom, where this idea of being uploaded was something that could exist in the 80s. So like Tron, RoboCop, Max Headroom, are these ideas of memory upload, and I think each time essentially carries its own desires into these objects. So, I mean, it could be an analogy to everything here as well, if all this stuff could be thought of as just an inanimate object that's just waiting to be resuscitated, whether it's by our own imaginations or by some future technology that will find some way to communicate with it in its own way as well. And so, yeah, the cryonics works as an analogy as well as a kind of literal example of some of those desires that we have for ourselves and for the future, and for wanting to communicate with things in a future time. So.